Hello, and welcome to this week's dialogue with Helga LaRouche. She is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is November 8th, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host. If you have questions or comments for us, send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now, last weekend, there were several million people marching for peace around the world, calling for a ceasefire and ending the Netanyahu's mighty vengeance campaign, which has already killed more than 4,000 children in Gaza. But at the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo, there was no resolution for a ceasefire. In fact, it was rejected. And U.S. Secretary of State Blinken reaffirmed U.S. support for Netanyahu's actions. And he said a ceasefire would lead to an unacceptable result. Now, given this, it's clear that there is a cry from around the world for peace, but it doesn't seem to be falling on receptive ears in the West, especially in the United States and the NATO countries. So, Helga, what's your assessment of where things stand and what needs to be done?
Well, I think it's, there are many people who said important things, but I want to quote the General Secretary or Secretary General of the United Nations, António Guterres, who said that Gaza is turning into a graveyard for the children. And I think that captures the situation the best. He also said that this is not a crisis of the region, but a crisis of humanity. And I think that that is absolutely the case because, there is no doubt anymore what is happening in front of our eyes, that, the proportionality with which Israel is answering to the attack of October 7th is completely out of proportion, that, more than 10,000 people have been killed, 4,000 of them children. And, there is no way to rationalize what is going on. And it is also very clear that, the aim is to basically, Israel wants to stay after the war is over, whatever that means, in Gaza. So I think there are several levels on which this thing has to be looked at. One is the immediate danger of an escalation into a wider war. You have an unbelievable deployment of US military force in the region. You have the 2 US aircraft carrier groups in front of the coast of Israel. Then the latest news were that the Ohio-class submarine, probably the USS Florida, is on the way to probably the Gulf. And, the only reason why you would have such a vast deployment, it's mooted that there are 30,000 American troops deployed there, is in the expectation of a wider war, possibly, opening a second flank with Lebanon and Hezbollah, somehow, involving then Iran. Now, if that happens, we are in the immediate danger of an escalation of a war way beyond the Southwest Asia, so-called Middle East. Now, that is the one danger. There are major efforts by both China and Russia to try to propose an immediate peace conference for the entire region. There is hectic diplomatic activity. The Organization of International Cooperation, that's the large Islamic organizations and countries organization, who altogether have over 1 billion members. There will be an emergency meeting this coming Sunday called for by Saudi Arabia. The meeting will take place in Riyadh. And naturally, the new factor in that situation is that Saudi Arabia and Iran have re-established diplomatic relations, and they're working together on the effort to try to coordinate some response. I mean, that's, then there are many bilateral discussions and so forth of Lavrov, of the Chinese in particular, talking to all the Arabs. And, however, this thing could really only be stopped in the United States because, Israel is one thing, but, if the United States would definitely say, that this has to be stopped, it could be stopped. But it is Blinken who went around in the region talking to various Arab foreign ministers, and he basically refused to use the word ceasefire. Now, there is the immediate effect this has in Gaza itself, in the West Bank, where since the October 7th, 133 Palestinians were murdered as well. And one can only, one can only start to think what people are going through now that the cold and rainy season is starting. Half of the people are already homeless. They have no food, they have no shelter, no water, and it's just unbelievable that there would be people who are not calling for a ceasefire in front of this situation. But there is a larger aspect. The larger aspect is the danger of a military escalation into a beyond the region war. But whatever happens, the fact that the Western establishments did not respond to try to cool down the situation and go for a ceasefire, go for humanitarian intervention in Gaza. This is changing the image of the so-called rules-based order for good. Because if you look at what people are saying around the world, in Germany, for example, in Britain, in Sweden, in the United States, there is an effort to impose gag orders so that people are not allowed to comment on that. For example, in the United States, there is a congresswoman. Her name is Radisha Tlaib. She's of Palestinian origin, and she said that there is no difference for her between the cry of Israeli children and Palestinian children, and what is wrong with the people who only hear the cries of the Israeli children. So there is now an effort to censor her, and there was actually a vote in the Congress to shut her down. There are similar moves in Sweden, in Germany, where there is a reaction to the demonstrations which took place last Saturday. And I'm not commenting on, if all of these demonstrations were focused in the right way or not. The point is, if you have right now an ongoing situation which many people, including President Lula, including the former head of the UN Human Rights Division in the United Nations, who resigned over this situation, who said that he has seen many genocides, but this one is the worst. And they all call it genocide. Now, if you look at what the Latin American governments are saying, they have a complete, condemnation in unmistaken terms. And I think that if the West is not changing their attitude on this question, that they are losing their reputation in the global majority, majority of the world population will be lost, maybe forever, at least for this important juncture, where we see, in any case, a change, where the old colonial order is no longer, respected, and there are countries of the global south trying to create a new system. So if they, in this situation, then look what the completely immoral attitude of the countries of the so-called global north and the so-called rules-based order, if these are the rules, I think no country wants to be part of it. So I think that this whole thing will have, no matter what happens in the immediate period, it will have ramifications of a dramatic historic impact. And the former Prime Minister of Israel, Barak, he said that he thinks that the Israeli Defense Forces have maybe at best 2 weeks to defeat Hamas, because he thinks that the whole world opinion is crumbling, that the mood is even shifting in the United States, and that the loss of support for Israel will basically mean that 2 weeks at most, and maybe less, he said. So this is highly traumatic, and I can only say, if you cannot intervene when something is so going completely out of whack, then we do have indeed a crisis of humanity, as Guterres was saying.
Well, Helga, you just answered some of the questions in your opening remarks, but I'll give you these questions because you can get a sense of how people are looking at what you're talking about. From a contact in Southwest Asia, as well as one from Oakland, they both asked, why have the Muslim and Arab governments not done more to put pressure on Israel and the West, for example, an oil embargo?
Well, I think that the Arab governments could have done since a long time more for the Palestinians, and that I'm not going to make a big judgment about that, but that's generally the opinion of many people. I mean, why did they not invest their sovereign wealth funds into the Gaza, make it an example of economic prosperity? Well, I think this is now changing. I hope, and I think that this coming Sunday, when the OIC is meeting, I think they will come out with some policy, putting in the weight of the entire Islamic world behind it. And I think the best would be if they would full-heartedly support the Chinese and the Russian peace proposal. Both of these governments are demanding an immediate peace conference, basically a ceasefire immediately, humanitarian corridors immediately to save the people who are really in life, whose life is in utmost danger. But then beyond that, there needs to be a real settlement of the situation, basically like the Peace of Westphalia, where you have to bury the hedges, you have to say, for the sake of peace, all crimes on both sides have to be forgotten. For the sake of peace, one has to take into account the interest of the other, because without that, there is no peace possible. But then most important is there has to be a comprehensive, total economic development plan for all of Southwest Asia. This is basically the idea of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who already proposed in 1975 the famous Oasis Plan, which was the idea to, green the deserts, to develop new fresh water, to build basic infrastructure for industrialization and the development of agriculture in the entire region. And right now, if you look at this Southwest Asia, you have Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, which is North Africa. But this whole region has been destroyed by these interventionist wars. And the humanitarian situation in all of these countries is absolutely terrible. Naturally, now Gaza is the worst by far, but you need an economic development plan for the entire region. I mean, this is so urgent. And fortunately, with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the possibility to really look at the region as a whole as one comprehensive plan is absolutely there. So I think, I think this initiative will come from China for sure. I'm sure it will be supported by whatever Russia is doing. And, given the fact that the three major oil producing countries, Iran, the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, are in the process of joining the BRICS 11, they're all supposed to be full members of the BRICS by January 1st, 2024. I think the potential to turn the situation around and go for an economic build-up of the entire region is absolutely there. And if there are signs coming out in this direction, I think what the West, European nations, the United States, the best they could do is full-heartedly support that rather than looking at it as something to be defeated.
Now, here's a question about China's presidency of the UN Security Council and their call for an international peace conference. The person wrote that according to Craig Mokhiber, a top official of the United Nations who resigned, the UN is impotent to enforce its resolutions. Mokhiber accused the US, UK, and Europe of complicity in genocide, and the person asks, is there any other venue which can enforce international law if the UN is impotent?
No, I don't think so. I think that the United Nations is the only body in existence representing all the countries of the world. We have seen in the last years that the authority and integrity of the United Nations was undermined. I think one major step in that direction was when the United States lied to the UN Security Council about what the aim was of their operation against Libya in 2011, which that led to the NATO strikes and then finally the murder of Gaddafi. It was clear afterwards that the United States and NATO had planned a full-fledged attack, military takeover of Libya, and they had said that it was just an air operation. And that is why at that point Russia and China remained silent, or they voted neutral. Now, after it was clear that this was a much, much larger operation, from that point on, the UN Security Council practically did not function anymore because, when you start to lie in that sort of top gremium of the world, then, the potential to use it for peace purposes has been greatly diminished. And at that point, LaRouche absolutely presciently said that this was not just an operation against Libya, but that this was the beginning of a coming world war against Russia and China. And I think if you look at all the subsequent developments, the Ukraine, the Maidan coup 2014, the global NATO efforts to, really go for a global NATO with, involving the Indo-Pacific. What has the Indo-Pacific to do with the North Atlantic Defense Treaty? I don't know. So the problem is, we have seen that all the votes in the United Nations were completely compromised since, because only those countries who are strong enough that they feel that they can resist pressure voted their real opinion, their real, conviction, while many of the smaller countries, countries who are only a little island or a little country here and there, they normally would vote with the West on resolutions against Russia and China. And that has been naturally, noted by everybody. It's there is no secret. There's only stupidity, one can say. So I think the United Nations definitely needs a reform. There are many former UN officials who are working on such proposals, but I think that the 10 principles I propose for a new international security and development architecture. The last 3 principles are not programmatic. They are the first 8 principles, or the first 7 principles are programmatic, calling for a new credit system, health system, all of these things. But the last 3 principles I put in there having in mind the shortcoming of the United Nations. And that is, these 3 principles are philosophical principles, because I always thought, and I discussed this in the past a lot already at various occasions, the United Nations always suffered from a lack of what you could call a metaphysical component, meaning that, you have to have something in there which is beyond, daily necessities, programmatic things. You need something which pertains to the way the universe is organized. In European history, this was generally called natural law. Now, natural law has been rejected by modern days, legal people, because they said that's something you can't touch. It's not clear what that's supposed to be. But for thousands of years, 2,000 years, the idea of natural law was that there is something in creation which is, inherent part of the creation. Or if you don't want to be religious, you can say, which is part of the laws of the physical universe. And I think that the United Nations needs some grounding in such a principle, because that is in all great philosophies and religions, you have such ideas. In India, it's called cosmology, that the politicians have to respect the laws of the cosmos. In China, you have the idea that there is such a thing as a mandate of heaven, that if the government is not following the mandate of heaven, the people have the responsibility to replace that government. And natural law was the idea that, that this is a God-given law created with the creation, which human beings have to respect. And if they don't respect it, it will fall back on them and lead to their demise sooner or later. There are some other ideas, like, how do you train the mind to think about the higher one first before the many? This is important if you want to have the idea of the one humanity being the first principle for guidance of politics. And naturally, the idea about the nature of man, that you have to assume and go from the assumption that the nature of man is basically good, and that all evil comes from a lack of development and therefore can be overcome through development. Now, these were all philosophical questions which were debated by, great minds over the centuries. And I think, for the UN to go back to a functioning level as it was intended with, and still is very valid with the UN Charter, I think it would be important to include some of these more fundamental principles in a necessary reform.
Well, that's certainly a very profound answer to the question. And there's another question along those lines on the practical terms. Elio Hernandez asks on Facebook, should the UN remove the veto power for the Security Council because the system is outdated and not democratic? I think you sort of answered that by bringing in this question of a higher component, but maybe you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I think that would be a big mistake. I know it is not exactly, maybe not the final answer, but at this point, to remove the veto power would be opening it up to complete takeover, of, the kind of corruption we have seen in the recent years. So I think while, it is a little bit not totally satisfactory that this veto power is only in the hands of the 5 nuclear powers coming out of the Second World War, the way the UN developed then. Nevertheless, I can only say that if you remove it at this point and you would make it a democratic vote, you would have exactly that process of, where clearly countries are too weak to withstand pressure, and therefore I think this absolutely should not be done at this point.
Now, here's a question from a journalist in Pakistan. Again, you touched on this in your opening remarks, but he asked, do you think the U.S. has lost its credibility as the enforcer of the rules-based order? And if so, system?
Well, I have said many times that, the unipolar world is gone irreversibly. There is no way it will come back, and any effort to impose the so-called Western designed rules-based order on the rest of the world, where nobody knows what these rules are, and these rules are being bent at every occasion. If you want this aimed and you bend them in that way, then you want something else, you bend them in another way. This has become a farce, and it has been recognized as such. That on the other side, I'm not exactly convinced that the multipolar order in the world is the greatest wisdom, because it still implies the possibility and existence of geopolitical thinking. That one pole, you have multipolar, all the different poles are representing different geopolitical interests. This is no good, because geopolitics, in my view, the more this conflict with Ukraine and now with Gaza is continuing, the more I'm absolutely strengthening my conviction that geopolitics is one of the greatest evils which we absolutely must get rid of if we are supposed to survive as a human species, because geopolitics is exactly the kind of stuff out of which 2 world wars erupted in the 20th century. And if we don't overcome it now, by going in the direction of a new paradigm which puts the cause of humanity first, then we will probably not get rid of this mortal danger in which we are in. And the only country which has suggested something going in this direction is indeed China and Xi Jinping, who always talks about the shared community of the one future of mankind. And if you think about it, it's so obvious. We are sitting really in one boat. There is a shared community of the one future, because since the existence of nuclear weapons and pandemics and the internet, and I could list a whole bunch of other things which should demonstrate to people that we are sitting in one boat. If we have a nuclear war, it will be the rest that will kill all of humanity. And if we do not shape up, it will come to that. So we better think about that we are the one human species. So that's, I think, very, very important.
All right, now we have, I think, one final question from Thomas, who often sends in questions. And he's a little despairing about, you have millions of people marching, but the policies are not being changed. And he asks, Helga, can you give us advice on how we can keep optimistic when this killing is going on of a totally vulnerable Palestinian people?
Well, I think, one can indeed change the situation. And, I think that if the many people marching, it's very important that people go to take to the streets and express their demand for a ceasefire, their demand for a peaceful resolution. But all the marches I have heard about, read about, they are a little bit not yet strong enough. They keep chanting Free Palestine, which obviously is an important demand, but they don't have really power. I think if these demonstrations would be more idea heavy, so to speak, if they would really fight for example, for the Middle East peace conference, and even the Oasis plan, development plan, I think then they would gain a lot more weight. And I think we should work in the direction that these demands are being picked up by the different marches. I give you one very good example. There was just a wonderful conference in, of all places, Afghanistan, a country which has been completely forgotten by most people. It has been out of the news since about 2 years. There was a big hoopla when NATO left in August 21. Then what followed was a huge humanitarian crisis. But then, Afghanistan disappeared from the headlines. But, we worked on the Operation Ibn Sina economic plan for a coming economic miracle in Afghanistan. And that is, we worked out a very comprehensive plan, an economic development plan, taking into account every aspect from infrastructure, energy, health, industrial, water management, just every aspect. And there was just a wonderful conference in Kabul, which completely adopted that program with 600 participants. And, there is now a tremendous idea to build up economically Afghanistan. I think this is excellent news, and that is an example which can be replicated by every single country. You need such economic development plans, and if you find patriots in every country who fight for their sovereignty and the build-up of their country, I think there is reason to hope, and we can turn this around. I think that, Leibniz was absolutely right when he said that a great evil, always evokes an even greater good. And I think that is exactly the principle of the universe, and we need a lot of people of goodwill, but I think we can absolutely do it because that's how the universe is.
Well, Helga, we do have several emails of congratulations to you, since Operation Ibn Sina was originally your idea. And people are very enthusiastic about the potential for this kind of development program. So I think we've come to the end of our questions. Do you have any final comments?
No, I think it's obvious if you look at the strategic picture, you have, if former Prime Minister Barak says the situation with Israel is about 2 weeks, I don't think they can win against Hamas in 2 weeks. So that is a certain point, deadline crisis, a window of, where certain things have to happen or they don't happen. Similarly, you have now a public debate in Ukraine where I think the Zaluzhny, I forgot now what his exact position is. He's a top military, maybe even general. Harley, can you just help me what his position is?
Yeah, he's chief of the general staff of the Ukrainian army.
Exactly. So he just came out and said there is no way how Ukraine can win this war because Russia is way ahead in terms of economy, military buildup, ability to produce weapons. So that, Ukraine should better negotiate even at the, loss of certain territories, which naturally has caused a huge, upsetness about him and his remarks. But it's true, so what General Kuyat, former Inspector General of the German Army, had said end of August, that NATO soon would be faced with a situation to either go for a ceasefire and a diplomatic solution, or there would be the danger of an escalation. That is the same. You have now two situations where that is exactly the alternative. In Ukraine and in respect to Israel and Gaza, this is not going to go on forever. And the only way how we can avoid World War III is to have a ceasefire now and to have a diplomatic solution. And I appeal to all of our listeners and viewers, that is you, please join our effort. We have this International Peace Coalition, which we are building. Every Friday we are having very important discussions. If you want to cooperate in that, it does now exist we have now members participating from, 4 continents. I think we are still lacking Australia, but all the other continents are represented. Join this effort and make the voice for peace and a better world heard, and cooperate. Do not be passive. Get active with us. These are the most important weeks of our life.
Well, Helga, thank you for that, and thank you for your inspiration overall. And hopefully we'll make it to next week and have another conversation with you.
Yes, one hopes.